Ladies and gentlemen, to kick off our inaugural conference for the keynote address, we are now honored to introduce today's keynote speaker for the day, Professor Mariana Mazzucato. There is little need for introduction for the uninitiated. Professor Mariana Mazzucato is one of the world's leading voices on the role of economic policy in driving innovation and delivering public value. As cities confront the cascading crises of biodiversity loss, climate instability, and water insecurity, Professor Mazzucato's work offers a critical lens through which to understand these interlinked challenges, not just as environmental issues, but as economic ones rooted in how we define and govern value. Her pioneering advocacy for mission-oriented innovation has reshaped global policy thinking, urging governments to lead with purpose, invest strategically, and design economies which are both inclusive and regenerative. Today, we explore how to restore urban biodiversity and build climate and water resilient cities. There is no one better positioned to challenge and inspire. Please join me all in welcoming Professor Mariana Mazzucato, Professor in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value, Founding Director, Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, IIPP, University College London, UCL, best-selling author of titles including Mission Economy, A Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. She will be delivering her keynote address, a mission-oriented approach for putting biodiversity, climate, and water at the center of our economic systems. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and what an honor to be here, especially to follow such an inspirational speech by Your Honorable Excellency, Crown Prince, and the leadership of this particular property company, not just any property company, putting these issues at the heart of how you actually produce. Because we all know that there is so much greenwashing, biodiversity washing, climate washing, water washing, everything washing. And so how do we not do that? How do we actually not think about corporate social responsibility as an afterthought after we do all the bads and create these negative externalities, but actually put biodiversity, sustainability, and taking care and really caring about our climate at the center, basically, of how we do capitalism. And that's really what I want to talk about. And it was really great that we heard also about COVID, because COVID also taught us something very important, that we are too late. It's too late to react to a crisis if we are not prepared beforehand. The economic consequences of COVID were much, much worse than they had to be. So had we actually invested in global health systems properly and took care of our planet and actually thought about that very important link which you mentioned in terms of the relationship between climate, biodiversity, and health systems, we would have all been better off. But during COVID, something else happened. We often heard the word the war room, the COVID war room. What does that mean? If you think about how government did government during those 2 critical years, we often saw that we had an interministerial approach. There was the Department of Education. There was the military, which in some countries actually was responsible for a vaccine rollout. There was, of course, the Department of Health, the Department of Finance for making sure that people who were locked down and not working actually received funds. But we only tend to do that, again, when it's too late. We think in this holistic way, either during war, and wars are not good, and unfortunately we are living through a period of huge geopolitical tension, so war is in our minds, and Malaysia is actually hosting, of course, attempting to host a peace agreement between 2 countries as we speak. But war is not a good thing. COVID is not a good thing. So why is it that it's only when we have this kind of urgency to solve a problem, right? No one says we'll win the war in 30 years. When countries go to war, they want to win now. When we want to solve COVID, we don't say we'll do it by 2030. We'll do it now because there's too much suffering on the ground. Why do we have to wait for these bad things to happen and be so unprepared to wake up and realize we need to work intersectorally in terms of all the different businesses and industries that are parts of the solution to the crises that we have today around climate, biodiversity, water, and health pandemics, but especially around governance and government Climate change, of course, is not just for example, the Department of Energy. It's just as much for the Department of Agriculture, those in charge of also food systems, Department of Health, Department of Transport, right? Sustainable mobility. And the fact we're talking about cities today, cities are microcosms of what happens across the world. Homes, transport, food systems, schools, school lunch, right? It's often cities that are also responsible for organizing school lunch, but not just lunch like ketchup is a vegetable, which a president in the US once said when he wanted to reduce the cost of school meals, but healthy, tasty, sustainable lunch in our schools. So how do we actually learn from those periods like COVID, but unfortunately also like war, of how to wake up and actually work again in an economy-wide way and not wait when it's too late, where the costs of inaction are so much greater than the cost of action. And the reason I wrote one of my recent books, Mission Economy, was basically to say, if we did things, you know, up there in space, like we do things here on Earth, we would have never gotten to the moon. The moon landing, if you break it down, it wasn't just an aerospace feat, it was just as much a political economy feat. And it was also kind of a cultural narrative feat. If you remember the speeches that Kennedy gave, he said, we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. That means welcoming the uncertainty, welcoming the experimentation, welcoming the trial and error, the experimentation, the kind of gov lab mentality that, again, the military knows it has to do, but then on Earth we pretend that things are just about facilitating. I'm Italian. Facilitating comes from Latin facile, meaning to make something easier, right? So Kennedy, to get to the moon, said we're doing it because it's hard, not because it's easy. That means welcoming difficulty, welcoming uncertainty. It's not one side facilitating the other or de-risking. I really detest the word de-risking. Please never allow anyone in this conference to use it. De-risking makes no sense. It makes it sound like there's some risk takers here, and they're often called the value creators, the wealth creators. And there's another side, probably government, but sometimes also philanthropies, that are supposed to de-risk these people. Now, if you were a young, we just heard about the youth, if you were a young, super smart person coming out of high school and going to college and you want to go work and solve the world's problems around biodiversity, would you rather be a de-risker or a risk taker? Of course you're more willing and interested in being a risk taker. So we've already set up this problem in a problematic way by setting it up as this cartoon image, as though some are going to take the risks and do the cool, creative things and think out of the box, and others are just going to help them out on the side to cheerlead and to enable, facilitate, de-risk, you know, set the rules of the game and then get out of the way. We would have never, ever gotten to the moon had that been how NASA, for example, or any space agency, and there's different important space agencies around the world, thought about space. Okay? So what I'm super interested in is changing this kind of, I shouldn't swear because there's too many esteemed guests, but this fake, false narrative, this cartoon image that we've kind of gotten used to thinking, where, for example, there's the wealth creators and the other side, there's the market fixers. We're going to fix the problems that happen along the way. What we actually need is to shape our economy to deliver on all the goals and values that we have. And we need to do it in such a way that fosters growth, of course. Otherwise, we won't have jobs, we won't have productivity, and so on. And that's why, again, the opening of this conference was so important. It's not about either do growth or have values. In how we actually approach growth, how we get to the moon and back in a short amount of time, we can actually foster all sorts of different investments and innovation, which ultimately drive growth, because growth is an endogenous function of those investments. And in this country, of course, there's a wonderful thing happening, I think, at least, because I'm here to learn, not to preach, even though economists are very good at preaching, but this concept of Madani. I'm pronouncing it like an Italian. You probably pronounce it, hopefully, something similar to that, where you talk about sustainability, prosperity, innovation, respect, trust, compassion. That is not how we are currently designing our global capitalist system, whether it's at the city level, at the regional level, at the national level, or at the global level. So having those values in terms of a vision of a country in Malaysia, talking about Madani with these 6 very important values, that means literally doing capitalism in a very, very different way. And just coming back to the moon landing, what was so interesting, by the way, was that the first thing they did, and I even know these people's names. I don't know how I remember because I forget everything. I don't remember what I had for breakfast, but I remember these stories about how they got to the moon because it was so important. There was a guy called Ernest Brackett. He was the head of procurement, right? Government purchasing. And don't forget, purchasing, what governments purchase is often 30% of their budgets. And he said, there is no way we're going to get to the moon with the status quo, with how we currently are thinking about purchasing. So he said we need to change how we do procurement from just cost plus, thinking about the bottom line and making things kind of cheaper along the way and giving the contracts out to whoever's going to produce with the lowest costs and lowest prices, to outcomes-oriented procurement. He said, challenge-oriented procurement, fixed-price procurement with extra incentives for the innovation and the quality improvement that happens along the way. And he said, so if the goal is to the moon and back, we need to solve so many problems along the way. What are the astronauts going to wear? What are they going to eat? How will they go to the bathroom? Literally, how will they go to the bathroom in the lunar module? And so they had a big mission, and think of the biodiversity-related missions in cities, but in nations and so on. How do we break it down into solving lots of different problems along the way, but through tools like outcomes-oriented procurement? And by doing that, they fostered so many different solutions: baby formula, baby diapers, camera phones, software, home insulation. These were all solutions to the particular problems the astronauts had to get to the moon and back in a short amount of time. If you look at the history of the current software industry today, it actually very much dates back to the different problems they had in the lunar module in terms of the data and the communication back with Mission Control Room. So this is what I mean by mission economics. I just wanted to give a bit of time, right? Because otherwise we can use the word mission just to mean goal, vision. No, missions for me are start with the challenges, and at this conference we're talking about biodiversity challenges. Turn it into a moonshot that we can actually answer, yes or no, did you achieve it? They didn't stop with the space race. They said to the moon and back in a short amount of time. Get as many different sectors across the economy to innovate. It wasn't just aerospace, it was materials, electronics, nutrition, and so on. And change the instruments that governments have, and governments are very important, to catalyze as much bottom-up, I repeat, bottom-up innovation towards mission accomplished. So clear direction, we were talking about it before with CEO Simon Darby, clear direction is what government needs to provide. Often those early stage, high capital intensive, risky investments, but keep open the how. You cannot micromanage this process or we will stifle the innovation. We will stifle entrepreneurship. Okay, so challenge, mission, intersectoral, and bottom-up innovation, and in terms of the governance, it has to be intersectoral. So I'm glad I got that out of the way, and it's important for me to get it out of the way. Otherwise, as I said, not only do we have biodiversity washing, we have mission washing, these grand words like missions or moonshots. What do we actually mean by that? How do we make sure it's a provocation for doing things differently? For example, not just thinking about sectors, aerospace, renewable energy, quantum computing, digital. What does that mean? These are just sectors. What are we actually trying to do in the economy, and what does it mean for those sectors? What does it mean for different public-private partnerships that are not kind of parasitic, but truly symbiotic, truly mutualistic? And that's why I go back to the 6 values that you have here under Madani. That's about the how we relate one to another, and I'll come back to that point at the end. And I wanted to reflect a bit, just because I just spent 2 years now working with these fantastic people. You might recognize some of them. The president of Singapore, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, who used to be the finance minister of Singapore. That's when I first met him. And Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, she's the current head of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and Johan Rockstrom from the Potsdam Institute. The four of us recently ran this commission on the economics of water. It was the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. And the point was, by the way, to link the global hydrological cycle to the problems around biodiversity, to the problems around climate. And I want to reflect on the work that we did, bringing this idea of mission orientation to the solutions that we actually need to foster around the links between these three huge issues that, again, have to go to the core of how we do capitalism differently. And I also want to say that we should, as a team of individuals who care about these problems, resist the silos that we are often put into. So this conference, very important around biodiversity, but it's obviously linked to other conferences on climate change or other conferences on water, right? And we have currently globally these three big conferences that happen every year called COP, right? There's the COP Biodiversity. Last year it was in Cali, in Colombia. I was there, it was fantastic. There was a COP in Baku in terms of COP Climate, and there was a COP that I also went to in Riyadh on land and water. Now, why do we have these three different COPs if the problems of climate, of biodiversity, and water are so connected? And as long as we're always making those connections, then we don't have a problem. But if these conferences, including this one today that we have here, which is so important, ultimately make us go down our different rabbit holes, then we are part of the problem. So we really need to resist that. And one of the things that we really focused on in this work was talking about the interconnections constantly. And in terms of the global hydrological cycle, it is completely tied to the biodiversity problem. 70% of the water cycle is green water. It's not the blue water in the lakes and the rivers. It's the green water that depends on the soil and the carbon sinks in the soil, which the forests, the wetlands, and a biodiverse soil produces. It's the water that transpires after it rains. It transpires and goes back up into the clouds and often forms rivers in the clouds. And that is part of the global hydrological cycle. It transpires and ultimately it becomes clouds and future rainwater. And when we then deforest the Amazon, deforest the rainforests, and I just spent 3 days in Langkawi at the Datai resort, and let me tell you, wow, what a place. But if we deforest these amazing rainforests or all go down into our little silos, those three different silos I mentioned, we are contributing to not only the loss of biodiversity, but the loss of water globally. And there's not enough discussion about this. And if you look at these figures, these are figures that we came up with modeling in the work, that there is between 8 and 15% future GDP loss. And of course, we shouldn't just care about GDP, but it is an important measure that countries care about, if we do not solve this global hydrological problem where we are not taking care of the full cycle of blue and green water. And 55%, over 55% of the world's food production is currently in areas with depleting freshwater supplies. And biodiversity loss is a key both cause and consequence of that. And by the way, this causes wars. In fact, we can look at the different wars happening around the world, and definitely the one in the Middle East, and you can trace it back also to key issues around water, including also on the border, not just of Palestine and Israel, but also of Mexico and the US. There's rivers there, water moves. Whose water is it? So this is also causing huge geopolitical tensions. And again, climate, biodiversity, and water are not just about the science. This is about how people coexist. Again, so important in this conference. All the words you used were inspiring me. Coexistence, it sounds great, but if we don't think about these issues, we don't coexist. We go to war over these issues. And what did we mean by talking about water as not just a public good, but a common good? I'm actually writing a book now. That's partly what I was doing in Datai, reading through the manuscript, talking about we actually need to go beyond this concept of the public good. It sounds good. There's two words. One is good, But in economics, and I'll get to the economics in a minute, has anyone here done an economics class? I'm sure many of you have, you're probably just embarrassed. In economics, the public good is a really boring concept. It's just correcting for something that someone didn't do. Coming back to my cartoon image before of the risk takers and the de-riskers. In economics, the public good is an area where the private sector does not invest because it can't really appropriate the profits from it due to the non-excludable and non-rivalrous characteristics of that good. So that's why we expect the government to invest in natural, in clean water when we don't have it, in basic research and development, but also defense systems, because it's an area where if you do invest in it in the private sector, you can't exclude other peoples from benefiting from it, so you tend to have underinvestment in that area. Whereas what I'm writing about is how we actually need to go way beyond that. We need to talk about the common good as an objective, not as a correction. The fact that we talk about public goods as corrections to something already sets us up in a reactive, not a proactive, ambitious, and kind of happy, positive mindset. So what we try to do in this global commission, we try to use this missions approach, which I've been writing about now for decades, but also this new concept of the common good to change the mindset precisely to do what, again, I heard the introductions talk about, which is change a challenge, a problem like biodiversity into an opportunity, a massive opportunity for collective intelligence, for innovation, for investment, for new forms of partnerships. And so we began by kind of plotting out, first of all, just to make sure that everyone was on the same wavelength to the people that we were speaking to in terms of the economics of water for all. First of all, to make sure we understood just how interdependent we are. And that's also why we need a common good solution. By the way, again, during COVID, what was the mission? Was it vaccines? No, it should have been to vaccinate the world, right? Did we do that? No. How we produced the vaccine was not reflecting on the fact that we are interdependent, right? If some parts of the world are not vaccinated, the virus came back to bite, right? We produced what Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, called vaccine apartheid. Very strong word. We had hoarding of vaccines in the so-called global north, being then sent, in some cases, when those vaccines were expired, believe it or not, expired to the so-called global south. I say so-called because I don't like those words, but we don't have time now to debate that as well. Too much already on the plate here. So governing the hydrological cycle and biodiversity and climate as a global common good has to begin with the reflection, we're all interdependent. So it's not just about the values, it just won't work. It literally, the science won't work if we have biodiversity nationalism, climate nationalism, water nationalism, vaccine nationalism. Again, if we deforest the Amazon, it has been proved by the science to be linked to droughts and floods in other parts of the world because of that green water effect I talked about before. Okay, so we should care about it even just from opportunistic reasons, let alone because we have compassion and all those important values that Madani has underneath it. Second, the water crisis, climate change, and biodiversity loss, of course, are interconnected. So that's also why, let's make sure, as I already mentioned this, we don't all go down our little rabbit holes because we have an expertise in something. We have to be linking these different things up. And also water cuts across all the sustainable development goals. And you could probably say this as well for most issues around climate and biodiversity. And some of the commissioners we had on this global commission, I talked about the 4 chairs, myself, the president of Singapore, the head of the WTO, and a top climate scientist, but our commissioners were mayors. We had lots of different mayors and designers and architects, many interested in property, in real estate, in housing done right. And the mayor of Freetown in Sierra Leone, her name is Yvonne Sawyer, she said, look, do you know when most abuse against women happens? Literally rape happens when women go fetch water. When women and girls go fetch the water they do not have access to in their homes, which should be a human right. And if you look at the different problems around climate and water and biodiversity, it's hard to almost talk about any of the SDGs without understanding that they are also linked to these fundamental issues in terms of how we take care of our climate. And there's the obvious ones, like SDG 13 in terms of climate, SDG 14, life below life below the ocean, all those things that happen. I don't know if you've seen David Attenborough's new film, Ocean, you must go see it. But it really goes across the issue of partnerships, and of course we talked about infrastructure, housing, gender parity, hunger, poverty. How can we solve any of those problems if we don't take care of the planet, right? So again, climate, biodiversity, and water go across actually all of the SDGs. And lastly, it goes across all sectors in the economy. As I said, we wouldn't have gone to the moon had we thought of it just as a problem of aerospace. There was nutrition, materials, electronics, software, all those different solutions, baby diapers, insulation, software, right? So really understanding these problems as requiring, by design, not by coincidence, lots of innovation across the economy. And this, by the way, is something so important because industrial strategy in many countries tends to be framed as a sector strategy. I worked with, well, the UK government has become more unstable than the Italian government, which, let me tell you, is a hard thing to beat. But how many governments ago? About 4 prime ministers ago, I was trying to help the UK government think about its own industrial strategy, not in terms of sectors, but again, challenges and missions. And it was super inspirational because they had at the time these 5 sectors they said are going to be important to the UK economy. It was finance, creative industries, automotive, aerospace, pharmaceuticals. I said, why? Did those sectors just lobby their way up and, to be called an important strategic sector? Why don't we change this viewpoint towards the challenges the country is facing around housing, around clean growth, around healthy aging, around the digital divide, and then ask, what does it mean for those sectors, but also many others? Definitely property. How do we think about sustainable mobility, sustainable production of housing, so it's not just bricks and cement and more social housing, but the how we actually produce that housing matters as much as the homes themselves in the cities. So that, again, requires paying much more attention to the how public and private work together, but also that intersectoral dimension. And the fact that climate, biodiversity, and water actually go across all those different sectors should be then framed to help us really understand how to think about a mission-oriented approach, which then, by design, not by chance, fosters directed growth. And so what I've been talking about here is basically this image of how to think about earthly moonshots. Again, the challenges that a particular country is facing, starting with the SDGs, but we need, a local debate. Otherwise, these are just abstract challenges. I've worked a lot with cities, even neighborhoods in cities like my own in London, with Camden, which is the part of London where I work, working with the residents in housing estates to actually first debate, for example, the concept of clean growth and talk about what it actually meant for the people living in a particular part of London who wanted to feel that they had a voice in setting the missions themselves. And it was super interesting, by the way, because you might know that in many Western cities, there is not only poverty, but lots of hunger. And just look at the number of food banks in London or in many cities, including in New York. And one of the first things the residents in the housing estate said is they wanted the food bank to change and to become a green food bank, but even more important, a food cooperative. In other words, that they would have dignity, they would be valued, they would have a voice at the table and not just be spoken down to, oh, here's food for you, by, again, the wealthy or the handouts, the crumbs that are left over given to those that are really desperate. They wanted a voice, and I can tell you because we worked very closely with what became Camden's green food cooperatives, the facial expression of a woman and her child walking into a food bank is completely different from that same person walking into and working in a food cooperative. Completely different. And you only know this when you experience it, and that's what we need. We also need co-production, co-creation, co-ownership of these agendas. And my own experience around the mission-oriented approach, which I've worked on a lot, is that that issue of who sets the missions and how those missions are then accomplished matters as much as what the mission itself is. It cannot be this top-down process where we're all told what is good for us. And again, I think cities have so much to teach the world about that, because even though the money should flow, if you want, from the national level to the city level, otherwise we have many mayors that don't have budgets that they require, the lessons of how to do co-production and co-creation really have to go from the local to the national. And I had the honor of working with Pope Francis before he died, and he talked about this as the principle of subsidiarity, the principle that if we want to do good in the world, let's start from the most local level and understand those problems and listen, have empathy, work with, not work at people. And then you build up the solutions from the people who've most experienced those problems. Anyway, so as I've talked about the missions approach for me, which I think can become a tool for Sime Darby, but any company that is serious as you are about working on the issues of biodiversity as how you do capitalism and not just corporate social responsibility, it means being part of a system where a mission that is very clear, where we can answer yes or no, did we achieve it, requires that intersectoral and bottom-up experimentation. And you know, if missions are boring, it ain't gonna work. Just remember all those people looking at the sky, coming back to the moon landing, how it inspired so many young people to study science. So that's also why we need to interpret the mission at the most local level. It needs to mean something. Again, coming to the school meal example, get kids to be part of that, designing school lunch. You know, kids love lunch. I remember lunch was my favorite subject, right, in school. So why not think of healthy, tasty, sustainable lunches as a mission itself? Allow every child in a country to have at least one, if not 3, meals a day that are healthy, tasty, and sustainable, and get them to be part of that process. Make those issues go across the curriculum. Their biology class, their literature class, why not? Their math class, and of course the classes where they might even be learning about agriculture and so on. So they have to be bold and inspirational. They have to have a clear direction so you can actually answer yes or no. Did you achieve it? Otherwise, blah, 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 right? We just talk about the challenges, but no one knows, are we achieving it or not? Because it's so vague what the actual mission is. To the moon and back in a short amount of time. That was quite clear. Ambitious while realistic. So also working and stretching the national capacity, not just kind of making up areas that are never going to happen, but especially these issues I've already talked about, cross-sectoral, interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary I didn't mention, but it's important. It means this is not just for the STEM subjects. We need poets and artists in the cultural sector. It's not a coincidence that Roosevelt, during the Great Depression, during that recovery, he brought artists, designers to the table. Why? Because we need to reimagine. What kind of society do we even want? And what, you know, who better than poets and writers and artists to help us reimagine what kind of world we want to live in? And again, I come back to your concept of Madani with those 6 values. That's about reimagining what kind of society, what kind of world we want and everyone deserves in terms of also the human rights. So interdisciplinary, don't forget, encourage your kids to read poetry, to read literature, and not just to do STEM subjects if you're interested in biodiversity. And again, driving those multiple bottom-up solutions. Otherwise, it's top-down, and it will kill innovation and entrepreneurship. And I was quite lucky, because academics, again, blah, 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 a lot. But back in 2017, when I started thinking about missions on the back of a decade of thinking of this concept of the entrepreneurial state, I managed to convince the European Commission to adopt this concept. It's now an instrument in the Horizon program. Not enough money. There's about 30 billion euros dedicated to it. Per capita, that's very little if you look at, you know, across the member states, but it's an interesting example, sandbox test of what it means to do things differently. So instead of thinking about sectors like oceans as just marine, or instead of thinking about climate as just about energy, using this missions-oriented approach, they set, for example, a mission around 100 carbon neutral European cities by 2030, and again, thought about what it meant for all those different sectors, including real estate, energy, mobility, food, the social sector, the digital services that are required. It's very interesting, by the way, to look at what this means in terms of particular examples where it worked. So Denmark, Copenhagen, city in Denmark, wanted to be the greenest city in the world, and they managed to actually foster an incredibly dynamic green, high-tech digital service industry. They are the #1 providers today of high-tech green digital services to China. And as you know better than me, China is probably the country that is investing the most in reducing the material content of production across the whole supply chain of their economy. And little tiny Denmark is servicing it in terms of its digital services. So digital shouldn't be seen as a sector. It's an input into solving so many different problems, whether it's going to the moon or having our carbon neutral cities. Anyway, so again, I keep putting up my little mission maps here just to make sure we're not using words like moonshots in missions in a lazy way. We need to use it in a provocative way that forces us to change how we work. And in the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, we use this mission approach. That was sort of my role in the commission, and thought about these 5 bold mission areas within which we recommend countries then to think of their local, their city level, their regional level, their national level missions that address these areas. And you see that one of them is conserving and restoring natural habitats critical to protecting green water because of that link between biodiversity and the water cycle. But also the fact that so many children die every hour due to polluted water. What does it mean to say no child? Not less, all these percentages. No child should die because of the water they are drinking. Again, what does it mean for all the different investments that we require? And when I say the how matters as much as the what, this is why we need to always be careful. Growth is not the mission. Growth is the result if we get this right. Partnerships are not the mission. Partnerships are what you need to actually fulfill and complete that mission accomplished. So governing partnerships, property rights and contracts, shaping finance for a just and sustainable future, harnessing data as a foundation for action, building the right governance structures. This is just absolutely critical towards actually achieving these missions, but that's not the mission itself. And the reason I say that is there's sometimes confusion on the economic outcomes and what the goals are. So again, going to the moon and back, all those examples I gave of the innovations that came from it, that's what fostered growth. They did not do the moon landing because we need to grow, we need a space, sector. No, they had a problem to solve that required the innovation across all those areas, and lo and behold, it caused a huge amount of growth because those innovations were then also used on Earth and required that public and private investment, which is a driver of growth. And again, the different mission maps, this is a particular one that's interesting for a biodiversity conference, reducing at least 30% of the degraded forests and inland water ecosystems globally by 2030, aligned with the biodiversity targets. What does it mean for food production, financial services, forestry, real estate, marine, construction, and so on? I mentioned before to the CEO of Sime Darby that Venice, which is actually where I'm from originally, my family's from Padova, has every 2 years an architecture biennale. And Abu Dhabi won it some years ago, I think it was 4 years ago, due to a new way of making cement, cement done with salt, very low carbon cement. So if we're interested in property and housing that is truly sustainable, we need to really think through those materials that currently are part of the problem. And you might know that in Germany they have green steel. Where did German green steel come from? Not because they went to Davos, the World Economic Forum, to talk about purpose. It came from the fact that the public bank in Germany said, you know what? These sectors that are begging us for money, they needed loans, we're going to make these loans conditional. We'll help them, but conditional on those sectors changing, coming back to my point about intersectoral. So the steel sector, which was in trouble, it's actually in trouble everywhere, instead of just saying, help, 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 they said, help, and the German government said, okay, we'll help you, but only if you reduce the material content of production across the whole steel supply chain, which they did. They didn't tell them how to do it. They did it through repurpose, reuse, recycle technology across steel production. But then the problem is, as you were mentioning in our coffee just before the session, unless this stuff scales, unless we have also demand side tools like procurement that allows, for example, startups to scale up, but also these large companies producing steel to have a market, the cost will remain too high. So it's not competitive, not because of some deterministic laws of steel production, but because we haven't taken it seriously and haven't allowed it to scale. Think of what happened with Moore's law and chips production in the early stage of semiconductors. Had the US government not bought chips en masse, that learning by doing and cost curves that ultimately created Moore's law, the lowering of costs within chips production would have never have happened. So again, these things are endogenous to the degree to which we treat them seriously or not. I've also worked with Barbados recently. It's very interesting because leadership matters, and if you haven't heard the leader of Barbados speak, Mia Motley, please just hear any of her speeches at any of the COP conferences. But she, it was very interesting. Instead of thinking of Barbados as a small island state, if you look at it in the map, it's actually a large ocean state, huge amounts of ocean around it. And she set one of the missions to, by 2030, ensure that every Barbadian has equitable and reliable access to clean water and nutritious food that is affordable. This was actually done by the government itself using this missions approach. There was also submissions here. But again, using this idea of also taking, tourism, which Malaysia also relies on, Barbados relies on, as an opportunity to see tourism as a microcosm, just like cities are microcosms of life. Everything happens in a city. Everything also happens in a resort, right? We eat, we swim, we dress, we use energy, we drink a certain type of water, we relate to each other in particular ways. You can unpick that and change it, especially also the capital-labor relationships, by the way, within the tourism industry, which are not always good ones, to be more mission-oriented and asking what it actually means. And as I mentioned, this absolutely requires getting out of silos, not just the conferences, but especially how government works, how sectors are treated. And as I said, going to the moon was not just the aerospace sector, and definitely solving the climate, the biodiversity, and the water problems require Ministry of Health, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Agriculture, Trade, Industry, Planning, to work together like we do during COVID when it's too little, too late because of those costs of inaction. And I've also had the honor to work with different countries, in Brazil, for example, with their big public bank called BNDES, in Germany with KfW, but also helping to set up a whole new Scottish National Investment Bank in Scotland, and asking, what does it mean to do banking differently, to provide loans differently if we actually have a mission? So in Italy, Cassa Depositi e Prestiti is a public bank. It just gives out money when sectors need help. Does that help the country transform, or does it just patch things up and allow certain actors to survive, perhaps when they actually didn't make the investments they should have? That's very different from what I've seen recently in both Brazil and Germany. I already gave the German example, where again, the loans being provided from the KfW were conditional on those sectors requiring those loans to transform, to invest, and to innovate. This is why I talk about picking the willing, not picking winners. Picking winners is a concept where you pick certain sectors. No, let's pick those who are willing to work with you around your very ambitious missions. And they'll need extra help if they're small, but it's not about SME policy. It's about helping all those different companies, but also other types of organizations move in that right direction. And recently I wrote a paper with Raj Shah, who's the head of the Rockefeller Foundation, of, again, what this means for a new way to think about the social contract, of partnerships, as I mentioned, mutualistic, symbiotic partnerships, socializing both risks and rewards, instead of the dynamic I wrote about in The Entrepreneurial State, which was the history of Silicon Valley, where we socialize risks, but privatize rewards. Everything in your iPhones that's smart and not stupid, internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, was state-funded. Look at the 5 richest companies in the world. To what degree did we make sure that immense amount of wealth that was co-created also went back to be shared instead of siphoned off? And anyway, don't get me started on that. That's going to start another presentation. And thinking about this idea of partnerships, What does it mean for embedding this idea of reciprocity and conditionalities in, for example, water contracts? 80% of industrial wastewater is not recycled. That's crazy when it's the state giving the water right to Pepsi Cola, to Anheuser-Busch. Let's put into these contracts, whether they're property rights, water rights, procurement contracts, this idea that there's a direction we want to be going. And if you're not interested, get back to the end of the queue and come back when you change your mind. But if you are interested, you will be helped, of course. We need to be, again, picking the willing, but having the right kinds of contracts which embed in the how we work together already that goal of where we're trying to go. And again, this idea of designing the right kinds of partnerships, aligning multilateral national development banks for just water partnerships, embedding these conditionalities, shifting from a project-based approach to a more programmatic, portfolio-based, strategic approach will allow us, again, to make sure the sum is greater than just the parts. I'm not sure why my time just went up. I was ready to finish in the 1 minute I had left, but it's just gone to 10 minutes. Does that mean, oh, that was done on purpose? No. Yeah, okay. Interesting. Anyway, and why don't I just finish there, because I think I've said enough. I will just finish with this, crossing out of words, because as I began, it's not just about better policy. It's not just about better partnership. It really is about these new relationships that we require. And that's not going to happen with this very boring way that we currently talk about the economy, where we talk about the market, and then if things go wrong, it needs to be fixed. We need to co-create the kind of market, the kind of economy we want. We shouldn't be de-risking. We need to welcome that uncertainty. So we need to also have labs where we test stuff out. It's not about picking winners, picking the willing. And we have to also invest in the capacity. One of my recent books that I had up there in the beginning was how the consulting industry has helped to infantilize our governments. And it's not just the consulting industry's fault, and I have many stories in the book about it, but when governments are so fearful and risk-averse, they open the door to others just to get the rubber stamp, whether it's Deloitte or PwC, because they prefer that someone else, if something goes wrong, then they are responsible. We need to invest within our civil service, within our public service, to be capable, to do the co-creation, to work well with the business sector, and to have that empathy to even be listening to what citizens require. And that requires an insourcing. And that's why I've also written recently during COVID of which countries did the best during COVID. It was actually countries that on the back of previous crises, like the Nipah virus, had actually invested within the public administration. If you look at what happened in Rwanda, Togo, Vietnam, and Kerala, super interesting to see how important those investments within the ability even to govern data and digital platforms was given the infodemic. So this real call to action to be investing within both the private and public actors. And I mentioned that I would just quickly say what I was doing in Langkawi. This is my last slide, and I was lucky to speak to the Pope before he died about this paper. The new economics of the common good, this is, again, where the how matters as much as the what. Read Aristotle during your summer break. He talked about the telos, the goal, but also the polis, P-O-L-I-S, the how we build community. And again, my experience in cities, they are the places where communities actually can also be built because we are closer to each other, and we should use, exactly as we heard before, examples where the property developers, the local council, and the mayor, you will be hearing from Maimouna Sharif later today, the financial sector work well together to actually deliver the kind of housing that, for example, builds community and sustainability at the same time, and it's not just more bricks and mortar creating other problems that have to be fixed somewhere else. And so I'll come back in a couple of years when the book is out, but just to say it requires a dashboard, clear purpose and directionality, co-creation, knowledge sharing, sharing rewards, so it's not, again, siphoning off the rewards to the shareholders, but having true stakeholder capitalism, and of course the transparency and the accountability. And let me just stop now, otherwise I will keep talking, but I want to thank you for the inspiration I even just heard in the opening remarks, and I hope this presentation will be useful to the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mariana. May I request for you to go to the center stage for a quick photograph before you depart. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, that was an eye-opening session. And in conclusion, the transformative keynote by Professor Mariana does leave us with a challenge to stop treating biodiversity, climate, and water as afterthoughts, and instead embed them at the heart of our systems, of how we design, how we invest, and govern our economies. In a world grappling with cascading crises, Professor Mariana's call is clear: reimagine public value, lead with bold missions, and build systems that are not only resilient but regenerative. The future, as she reminds us, isn't found, it's built.